We need not to F up in a disaster.
How should we think about decision-making in disaster situations?
Wow, Huples Cat and Wolfie. We're going to finish up looking at how you make decisions in disasters.
This is also applicable to your own personal preparedness.
This is a very important point. You personally probably don't have a government's finances and power to deal with and prep for disasters. You're just you with the limited circumstances that you might find yourself in. But I think it's important to remember that human beings have been surviving and thriving for tens of thousands of years without actual technology or much technology. You can do it, won't be very pleasant.
When a disaster is looming, strive to understand as much as you can about the incident and your place in it through a size-up process.
This starts long before the event with your disaster plan, your thinking and research, and your preps.
Then, continue to maintain situational awareness by processing new information as it arrives and considering how that may shape your plan of action.
Stay thinking, stay evaluating, stay flexible.
As individuals, life safety is where we need to focus because rarely can we directly address the cause of an incident.
If you can, get formalized disaster training, from basic CPR to wilderness first aid, from stop the bleed to CERT training. There are many free and low-cost options available to you, both in person and online. Online does not provide very realistic or muscle training, generally speaking, so you may have to supplant online and reading books and watching videos, getting out there and practicing it on your own. Not as great as going to a wilderness survival course, but it helps. Anything you can do that actually is physical as well as mental reinforces the physical and the mental. It works. Get trained. And training is not just watching one or two preppers online and agreeing with their thoughts.
To respond safely. Ensuring that a scene is safe and that an action is safe is a must. And here's a general rule. Don't put yourself or others at risk as you are working to respond to a crisis.
This is easier said than done. Consider it's been a big earthquake and your kid is stuck underneath the house. You can see his bedroom and it's crushed and they're not making any noise. And the rest of the house above that bedroom is tottering, maybe even on fire. How do you respond? The safe thing to do is to stand away, call 911 and wait for the emergency services to come. But this has been a colossal event and you don't have a cell phone signal. You're going to respond. How are you going to respond? How can you do it safer than just charging in? Think about it. What can you actually do in those circumstances to make yourself a little bit safer?
There's a concept called crew resource management, which is utilized in the fire service, but had its origins in commercial aviation. And I can't think of two fields that have a tighter focus on operational safety. The crew resource management, or CRM, doctrine is fairly detailed, so we won't cover it in its entirety, but there are several points that I think are valuable to raise. These are all addressed by the International Association of Fire Chiefs in their CRM guidance. Is the importance of effective communication when challenging a potentially unsafe or unwise action. If you disagree with something that someone else wants to do, something that you think isn't safe or isn't the best approach, CRM provides a mechanism for conveying that.
These and many other aspects will require explanation and training, preferably prior to the disaster. Again, if you're on a hike with the family and you want to practice using a ferro rod, don't say, we're going on a hike to practice using a ferro rod. Go on a really nice, fun family hike. When you get to say, hey, who wants a cup of coffee? I brought the stuff for coffee, or a cup of tea, and practice. You say, hey, let's try this. It's an old-fashioned method of doing it. Don't be so focused on the activity for the preparedness for the emergency. Be focused on having fun as a family. You can add stuff into it that's going to train you, great. But don't make training the only thing in your life that's important. But make sure you do get training.
Here's what doesn't work. What do you think you're doing? Are you nuts?
I see this in comments on my videos a lot.
Address the person by name, express your feeling, identify the problem, propose an alternative, and ask for feedback. Here's an example of how that might go. Joe, I'm concerned that this route will take us too close to the floodwaters. I think we should try Main Street instead. What do you think?
Of course, the probable answer in a high-stress situation is going to be, shut up, idiot, I'm driving, I know what I'm doing, right? So pick your crew carefully. Practice confrontational and discordant conversations as a group. See what it's like. Figure out little exercises you can do where it's not just straightforward, you go from A to B. Figure it out. Have problems. Let people realize that sometimes other people in the group actually have much valuable things to say than others. There's ways and means of practicing this. Having one person not listening, coming up with a plan and acting on it, and everybody else following them isn't the best way to survive, even if you're the person in charge and feel good about it.
There are a number of attitudes that can promote unsafe practices and that need to be challenged. Let me preface this by saying a lot of these may occur because someone is trying to help and they're convinced that they know how to help. They may believe that their answer is the best way to do it, so their hearts might be in the right place, but the implementation is flawed. If you see signs of these attitudes, it may be necessary to intervene.
In an ongoing catastrophe, removal of power from that person, or even worse for that person, may be required to ensure the group is safe. This is why practicing beforehand as realistically as you can is so important, if you can. Then you identify the strengths and weaknesses and you can talk about them and actually maybe correct them rather than have to deal with it in a real problem. More than a few non-commissioned officers and even soldiers in wartime units have found themselves accidentally killed by their own people because their people realize that if they don't remove that person from that leadership position or from the group, the whole group is going to die. You've got to be very careful about not listening and not thinking and being the leader because it's your preps and you've got the camo and the gun. Don't take anything for granted. Everybody's as important as everybody else, and if the group gets together and decides that you are a problem and have to go, you're probably going to go.
Going rogue. This is when someone takes the attitude of, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, flouting a rule and not being a team player.
My way or the highway. I will warn you, arrogance is huge in prepping, and oftentimes it's hidden with mealy-mouthed and questioning attitudes. Most preppers have major egos, and I would include myself in that. I would find it very difficult to allow somebody else to actually take control of what's going on in a disaster. But by practicing coming up with issues and scenarios and real life events, I can see the value of other people's thought process and experience, and hopefully they can see mine. So hopefully in a real disaster, we can function as a unit with different people taking command and control at different times and or of different specialties. It's not just going to be about the general in charge barking orders.
Acting first and thinking later. Always take time for that size up and an initial thought about what to do.
Now this is always going to be situational, but I'll give you one from last week. Our wood stove downstairs, the handle had worked loose, probably because of somebody, not me, overturning it the wrong way. However, we're both sitting there watching this and Kitty's having a bowl of raspberries for breakfast, and she stands up when she notices that the door's not functioning and it's loose, and with the bowl of raspberries in one hand starts literally, I don't know what she thought she was doing, trying to get it to open, trying to get it to close. She was messing around with it. She hadn't evaluated. She saw a problem and acted. She didn't prepare herself. Like, obviously you want to have both hands free. You might want to consider the fact the fire is very, very hot and the stove is very hot before you start going in there with one hand. I stood back and she wasn't happy I was standing back because I evaluated the situation. And what I did was I got a screwdriver and I tightened the handle. Problem solved. But she, without knowing it, risked a severe burn injury because if the door had opened, the wood was right on the side and she could have got burned. So after the event, because it's an emotional event for people who aren't actually acting rationally, be cautious, correcting and encouraging and all the rest of the stuff during the event. After the event, I was able to sit down and say, look, next time that happens and I'm here, can you let me just examine it and think about it? There was no problem. There was no smoke entering the building. We had no pressure of time. But by immediately reacting to the door, you could have created a quicker and worse situation and could have got burned. And she had to agree that that was true.
The hero complex. This is assuming that nothing will go wrong, that everything will be fine, and heroes don't have time to think, when in reality, we know that things can go wrong, and quickly.
This is typified by sudden and drastic action without thinking. You wake up at 3 a.m. there's an intruder in your lobby, in your house. You can hear them downstairs, stumbling around. You can hear the intruder. You grab your gun from the bedside table, you go down with the light, and you get your wife to phone 911. You see the intruder silhouetted. They're a young male, and you shoot them. Turns out it's your neighbour's kid who's drunk, got in the wrong house. However, he may have had a gun, and if you'd acted differently, he may have killed you. However, I would argue that oftentimes the actual decision to enter a position of danger, once that decision has been made, actually often, without proper evaluation, precludes thinking. And that's kind of what the last story about Kitty in the fireplace was about as well. Having acted without thinking, without evaluating, she then was stuck acting, couldn't back out of acting and say, hey, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm sitting down, what do you think? She couldn't do that. She was committed to fixing the problem, but could not fix the problem, and had entered the area to fix the problem in an unsafe manner. Be careful of doing that yourself.
Hey, look at me. This is the belief that you have to prove yourself, even if it means going out on a limb or showing off.
Beyond overworking, beyond not delegating, beyond always taking point, there is actually a much darker side to this. Back in the early 1980s, when I was a trainee puppy nurse in England, there was a male trainee nurse who was actually 6 months ahead of me, so he had 6 months more training than me. And we were both on a medical floor, and he was really struggling, not very flexible with the job, not doing very well. I was doing great. I was kind of really getting just about to the point where I was really kind of into nursing. What he actually did was he set fire to a linen cupboard and then put it out. I guess he felt that by finding the fire, fighting the fire, and saving the people, that he would be looked upon differently. And he was looked upon differently, because in about 4 seconds flat, they figured out that he had set the fire. They arrested him. He ended his nursing career and went to jail. There is a darker side to this. The hero complex, it can be dangerous.
Giving in. This is a concept of going along to get along, but with the underlying premise that it doesn't matter anyway.
This is really common. I've seen this online a lot. Everybody agrees with me about the vaccinations. Everybody agrees with me about liberals. Everybody I know has not had COVID. Everybody I know, and on it goes. The thing is, you're either bullying or in a position of power, or of a very low, small group of people that are very similar to you. So what you're hearing is the same stuff over and over, and of course everybody agrees with you. The truth is, a lot of people will agree with you because they can't be bothered arguing with you, or they know it's futile to argue with you, or there's no point.
Just hurry up. This occurs when the perceived goal is to just get something done so we can all get back to normal. That is, the sooner it's resolved, the sooner normal will be here.
We need a reset of society. No, we really don't. What we really need to do is avoid that. That would cause untold misery and death, and it would be a dreadful, dreadful calamity. What we need is those people that want the reset to actually be a positive change for good in their society.
The landing on the Hudson was dramatic, but it wasn't done to be dramatic. There was no, hey, look at me. There was not an artificial rush, as in just hurry up. The only time pressure was due to the limited flight time available. There was no giving in, as both members of the flight crew were continuously monitoring the situation, continuing to try to restart the engines, continuing to seek options. There was no hero complex, but rather a rational focus on the alternative most likely to save lives. There was no acting first and thinking later, but quite the opposite. If the flight crew had simply presumed everything would be all right and just tried to land in an airfield without thinking through the physics that would have rendered such an approach unsuccessful, the outcome would have been tragic. And finally, there was no going rogue, but rather strong teamwork.
How you can camp and kayak and canoe with all your family if you can. Experience and let them experience decision making under minor stressful conditions. Practice, teach, encourage, be calm. Now this doesn't mean your decision is the decision they have to come to. And if they come to a different decision, you go, yeah, you know what, yeah, I agree with that, but I'm going to do this and we're going to do this because you haven't taken into account X, Y, and Z. There may be occasions where you want to do that, but there may be occasions where you don't. Sometimes the best way of learning is failure.
After sizing up a situation, thinking through objectives, and responding safely, it's important to think carefully. And really, this means avoiding the pitfalls that can detract from recognizing the big picture of what's happening. Joseph Pfeiffer was a battalion chief in the New York City Fire Department on September 11, 2001. In fact, he was the first battalion chief to arrive at the World Trade Center and to initiate incident command. In 2018, he retired as the department's Chief of Counterterrorism and Emergency Preparedness.
I would argue that pretty much all of the first responders, not all of them, but most of them, and quite a few of the people that died in the towers could have been saved if the big picture had been noted.
In a provocative paper on crisis leadership, there are two barriers to effective crisis leadership that Chief Pfeiffer described. The first is what Pfeiffer calls operational addiction. Remember the importance of doing a size-up, maintaining situational awareness, and defining objectives, even if they're broad objectives that need to be accomplished. Operational addiction is the opposite of that. When leaders get so involved in the technical details of how something will get done that they miss the forest for the trees.
And that is the main reason I retired early from hospital administration in Ontario. My leaders were hopelessly unimaginative. They were rule-bound. Even worse, they were bringing more and more numerical control of nursing. This, of course, makes healthcare very, very expensive, inefficient, and inhumane, and eventually will have to be changed. But in the here and now, these people have the power, and they have their own groupthink, and they will not tolerate other people, often more experienced, telling them, that's not the way to do this. The less control we put on the nurses, the more efficient they're going to function. They don't believe that. They need numbers.
Normalcy bias can cause someone to fail to see a disaster or crisis for what it is, instead treating it like a situation that would be handled just as any other routine circumstance would be.
Remember 2020 and the public do not need to wear masks? I can tell you a lot of the healthcare providers who said that actually believe the main spread of COVID-19 was by hand, because SARS had been spread by hand and contact in 2003. Months into the pandemic, with evidence, they still could not imagine the fact that it was airborne. Refused, actually, to believe it was airborne. Now, the excuse they came up with later on was, well, we won't have enough for healthcare providers. Well, healthcare providers wouldn't have needed as many masks if the public had been masked and weren't all getting sick. Again, total failure of imagination, and it was right across the world.
As we now know from our prior sessions, disasters are different from everyday emergencies.
They require nimble and efficient and changeable decision making. They do not require a suffocating command and control system. They also require full up and down communication, up and down the wire. That again, I can tell you in 2020 in Ontario, healthcare with the pandemic did not ever occur. A few people said, we have to be open and communicative. And then they tried to be, and then people gave them criticism, and then they shut down.
In a major flood, there may be a temptation to think, 2 feet of water isn't that bad. It's like the time the yard flooded, just deeper, when 6 inches of water is actually enough to sweep a person away.
Somewhat stunningly, numerous preppers to this day exhibit this. COVID-19, they see a 0.5% chance of death as nothing to do with them and not a big deal. Despite the fact that that translates to 1 in 200 times you catch it, you die. I think that's a fairly big deal. The death rate can be higher and lower than that depending on other things, but the bottom line is even if it's 0.1% chance of death from COVID-19, completely ignoring everything else, that's still 1 in 1,000. That's pretty high odds. Would you get on a plane that 1 in 1,000 times is going to explode in a fiery ball? I would not.
In storms, persons may look for cues to see if it's really a tornado, and if no funnel cloud is visible, dismiss it as just another thunderstorm, even though tornadoes can occur without the classic funnel cloud formation. After an earthquake, it may be tempting to see a building still standing and assume that everything's fine, that everyone will be back inside tonight, when in reality, it's perilous and should not be occupied due to the damage that was caused.
When you hear people say that COVID-19 is just flu, you know, and I can assure you, and you'll be able to look at them now and think, aha, they're crippled with normalcy bias. They will be utterly useless to me, probably, in a real disaster.
What if Flight 1549's crew reacted as though this was just another engine blowout? They do happen, and so no special considerations were needed other than heading back to an airport. Or what if the crew had focused so heavily on the first option presented, returning to LaGuardia, that they missed the big picture that allowed them to see that return was not viable?
They and everybody would have probably died. There's going to be no second chances in a situation like this. This is where you need to train yourself and your crew, your family and your friends for disasters ahead of time. This can be formalized training, or it can just be enjoying family hikes and camping trips where aspects of disaster and group control and working together are ironed out outside of a major disaster event, not when a disaster occurs.
In a study of the December 7, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, Robert DeSortis of Science Applications International Corporation identified 25 deficiencies of leadership which can forestall effective response. There are three that particularly go together that tie all of this back to preparedness. They are the deficiencies of imagination, of insight, and of preparedness. And essentially what they're saying is this: one of the most detrimental problems in thinking and decision-making is not realizing what could go wrong.
The ship cannot sink. RMS Titanic, 1912. The towers cannot fall. People will help me.
Not recognizing that it could happen here. That's the failure of insight.
This is widespread in the West in 2020 during March to April. I'd argue it's still widespread. I just think they've got better at pretending it's not so.
And not preparing as a result. And that's the failure of preparedness.
Here he's being far too kind. You and me, we need not to F up in a disaster. We needed to have trained and practiced for this. We need to be able to avoid these pitfalls before a disaster exposes them.
Recognize that people are usually going to want to help in a disaster. Leading them requires a good size up, identifying objectives, responding safely and thinking carefully, and avoiding problematic thought patterns that might get in the way of this.
Next week actually is lecture 5 is Essential Survival Skills. It makes it pretty clear that you shouldn't actually just watch that lecture, you should actually go and get formalized training, but he goes through a whole bunch of things like choking and CPR and hemorrhage and a whole bunch of things. So I'm not really sure how I want to present that lecture. I am a trained RN and I'm not actually sure it's going to be of any benefit to have me wading into it unless there's an obvious thing I disagree with, but I think I'll give you a taster of that. So lecture 5 will just be a 20 to 25 minute lecture where I do snippets from, but not all of it, because if you want to get this series, then you would get that information. And I don't really know how valuable practicing medical and disaster first aid and survival techniques are by watching a video. It's a good idea to have read a book, it's a good idea to watch several videos, it's a good idea to practice it.
Crisis leadership and decision making sometimes approximate what political scientist Charles Lindblom called muddling through. This was his shorthand for noting that a fully rational decision-making process, which presumes full and accurate information, identifying and weighing all possible alternatives against some specified criteria, is both too time-consuming and unrealistic for many decision-making processes. That is certainly true in a disaster. So decisions must be made within the skills and constraints available. But keeping the principles that we've discussed in mind can at least help in guiding decisions toward those best structured for life safety, incident stabilization, and property preservation.
Anyway, that's it from me. Toodles.
Until next time, be safe.
This has been a 2021 Very Sleepy Terrier production.